Morning, this is a response to a video by lecondidant called Mind, Blindness and Many Gods Hypothesis. Hi there. Okay, just a little bit at the beginning. I understand what that was the video that I made that you're responding to here. It wasn't clear. I was trying to hold up special relativity as within an analogy. I wasn't really suggesting that some people are blind to special relativity. As I say, I was looking for an analogy for certain kinds of belief, but I can see that didn't really work. I understand the mind blindness that we're talking about, I think, pretty much. Okay, I've got some notes here, let me just see if I can work through them. Okay, atheists are blind, question, are atheists blind to or phobic of God, mind? As you say, they just can't be fucking bothered with it. Yeah, I think that would certainly be my understanding of that. Most atheists that I know, some atheists I know, I have to say, are very antagonistic towards it, perhaps because in the societies that they live, they've experienced some kind of discrimination or oppression because of their lack of belief in a God. So I can kind of understand why they would want to be a bit more aggressive about their disbelief. But I don't know anyone who doesn't understand the idea of a God. They might be biased towards particularly negative versions of what a God is. But then, nevertheless, I don't know anyone who's completely bereft of that imagination. You might, because you have far more experience with people who've got autism than I have, and it may be that people who have autism, of some versions of that, may indeed be, I don't know, you tell me, incapable of imagining that kind of thing. I don't know, maybe so. But everyone I know is capable of imagining it. They just imagine it and then think, it doesn't really lead anywhere, that. I'm reminded of the quote, I can't remember who it's from, Pascal maybe, but probably not. I have no need of that hypothesis. You know, that whole idea that, I don't know, some scientist said it. Where it got in all this. I have no need of that hypothesis. Doesn't add anything to the explanation. Okay, let's have a look at this. Then you go on to this really interesting section about what you're calling the many gods hypothesis, and you give some candidates of what kind of contemporary God might look like. Well, kind of. And you talk about language, inflation, fashion. Really great examples there, and language, which I thought was really interesting. Obviously there's an element of personification with many gods. I think you're a Buddhist, you said, so there probably is less personification in your belief system, which probably wouldn't count as having a god at all, you tell me again. But most gods have a kind of aspect of personification in them, don't they? So that, and intentionalism. So most people would say that their god has something like a character, something like a personality. You wouldn't probably put it in those terms, but they certainly act as if it has. My God is a jealous God, or my God is a loving God. And then would go on to say that their God has aims and objectives and plans, or at the very least, kind of global tendencies, a certain kind of overall trajectory, if not actually a plan. So in some ways I would say that yes, I like those ideas, that those things can be, those abstractions fulfill many of the criteria for what gods have traditionally had, but gods usually have a face as well, don't they? They're like personification of abstraction, which again isn't necessarily a bad thing, given that psychology, particularly human psychology, is one of the most complicated explanatory systems that we have. Daniel Dennett, the philosopher, talks about the intentional stance as opposed to the design stance or the physical stance, as a way of explaining. It's one of the strategies we use to explain why things are the way they are in the world. We might say, oh, it's doing that because it was designed that way, or it's doing that because it's in its physical nature. It's heavy, it falls to the floor because it's in its physical nature. Or we might use what he calls the intentional stance, which is we apply psychology. It's doing that because it believes this and it wants to achieve these kind of aims. And it's the most complex predictive and explanatory tool we have outside of very specific scientific, largely, disciplines. So I'm not surprised that we use the intentional stance and personify nature, because it's quite successful in many cases. I do it with my car and I do it with my computer. My computer isn't talking to its printer, I say, as if these things are in some kind of communication. So because it's a better explanation. It's not true, but it's closer to the truth than saying, my I don't know, using a design or a physical explanation. Anywho, where we go with this? Let's have a look. Language I've got here. Language and technology. Oh, you say language communicates through us, which is it's a really nice idea again, isn't it? Again, there's intentionality there, the idea that it's communicating. It covertly sneaks in intentionality. And I don't think that's what you intended. I think it's just embedded within the language itself, within that the way we think, that it's hard to say language, it's hard to make that point that you're making without conferring intentionality upon language. I mean, my follow-up question was, of course, that we do that to ourselves. The whole intentional project that we engage in ourselves and that we confer on one another is that, isn't it? It is a conferring. Anyway, that aside for the moment. Yeah, language does communicate through us, and if we strive for a kind of objectivity isn't the right word, but if we strive for a kind of detachment, an alien viewpoint on what the world is doing, and if we look at all the properties of the world, detached from these particular meat machines that we walk around in, then yeah, we could say, oh yes, this very extensive community of language that persists over long periods of time and uses the substrate of what appear to be human brains to move through it, and it is, we could make that kind of detached viewpoint. Of course, language doesn't complain when you stick a needle in it, but never mind, which is quite important. What have I got here? Personal relationships with God. I didn't really get that bit, I'm afraid, so I'm going to have to go back to that bit. Okay, relativity in the ether. Okay, I'm coming back to this first point. In retrospect, the relativity wasn't a very good example that I was using in the first video I made. What I was trying to get there was, it was a fairly cheap point to make, to do with the demand for evidence and explanation. But as you know, in the last century, the century before, it was at least reasonably widely assumed that the universe was full of the ether, wasn't it? Which the Michelson-Morley experiment finally put paid to, as far as I know. This idea that light waves moved in some kind of medium, and that medium was the ether. It wasn't exactly a competing theory to special relativity, but for a while they were both around, weren't they? So what is the status of that belief? It worked. It had explanatory power. The ether certainly did. But at a certain point, people said, you know what? We don't really need this as a theory. And other people were saying, well, yes, it still works. And so some people just said, prove it. Show me where this ether is. And it didn't work. It couldn't be shown. In fact, it was demonstrated not to exist. So it's that kind of a point I was trying to make, which isn't a very terribly significant point, but that's the point. Were people for years there just ether blind? Well, yes, they were kind of ether blind. Some people saw it was very obvious that ether clearly existed and had to exist, otherwise how could light possibly propagate? But it doesn't exist. There is no luminiferous ether. I've written at the bottom there, climate change blindness. I can't remember why I wrote that. I guess because you talked about ecology a little bit at the end there. So I'm just searching for other kinds of analogies. And these are just analogies, they're not part of the same argument. An analogy to mind blindness might be something like climate change blindness. Not that some people are congenitally or dispositionally unable to imagine climate change. Clearly they can. They just imagine it and think, doesn't sound right. I think they're wrong, of course. But yeah, perhaps that's a better analogy than the relativity one I used, or the luminiferous ether one I used. Anyway, thanks for these responses. I do enjoy that communication. I tend to post most of my videos on U-doubled, as you may or may not know, because I've had some differences of opinion with YouTube in the past. I'll stick this one on YouTube, but don't be too surprised if this conversation, I'm afraid, continues across sites. I hope that's not too irritating for you. Thanks very much.